My sister Darla thought she was filming another crazy homeless person for her Instagram story. She had no idea she was about to witness something that would leave an entire restaurant in stunned silence and change her perspective on judging people forever. Before we dive in, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you enjoy stories like this, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. Still get chills thinking about that Tuesday afternoon in downtown Portland. Darla had called me that morning, practically bouncing with excitement about her big lunch meeting at the Garden Terrace. She'd been working 18-hour days building her social media marketing business from scratch, surviving on ramen noodles and pure determination. This meeting with 3 potential corporate clients could finally be her breakthrough moment. "Maya, I'm telling you, if I land this contract, I can finally quit that horrible retail job," she'd said, her voice crackling through my phone speaker. "I've got my portfolio ready, my presentation is perfect, and I even bought a new blazer. With money I definitely don't have." At 24, Darla had always been the dreamer in our family. While I took the safe route with my accounting degree, she chased her passion for creative marketing despite everyone telling her it was too risky. She believed social media could change the world, that the right story at the right moment could make people care about things that mattered. The Garden Terrace wasn't just any restaurant. It was the kind of place where Portland's business elite sealed million-dollar deals over $40 steaks. Crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and a stunning outdoor patio that featured a gorgeous black baby grand piano. The kind of establishment where appearance meant everything and first impressions could make or break careers. Darla arrived 30 minutes early, her camera equipment bag slung over her shoulder alongside her laptop case. She always documented everything, believing that authentic moments made the best content. Her Instagram had grown to 50,000 followers by capturing real human stories, not staged perfection. Outside the restaurant's elegant entrance sat a man who didn't belong in that world of polished success. His name was Wesley Thornton, though Darla didn't know that yet. 67 years old, with silver hair that hadn't seen a professional cut in months, and clothes that had weathered too many cold nights. His cardboard sign, written in surprisingly neat handwriting, simply read, "Veteran, anything helps." But there was something different about Wesley that caught Darla's attention as she walked past. While other homeless individuals she'd encountered seemed defeated or aggressive, Wesley sat with perfect posture. His weathered hands rested calmly on his knees, and his eyes held a dignity that homelessness hadn't managed to steal. When he looked up at passing strangers, there was no desperation in his gaze, just quiet hope. What Darla noticed most was how Wesley's eyes kept drifting to that beautiful piano on the restaurant's patio. His fingers would move slightly against his legs, as if playing melodies only he could hear. She watched him for several minutes before her meeting, puzzled by the longing expression that crossed his face whenever he looked at those keys. The lunch crowd was already gathering, men in expensive suits talking loudly about stock portfolios. Women in designer dresses discussing charity galas they'd never invite someone like Wesley to attend. The contrast was stark and uncomfortable, setting the stage for what would become the most powerful story Darla had ever captured. She had no idea that the man sitting quietly outside, the one everyone was about to mock and dismiss, had once played those same kinds of pianos in concert halls across America. She didn't know that his weathered fingers had once commanded standing ovations from audiences who paid hundreds of dollars just to hear him play. All she knew was that something about Wesley felt important, like a story waiting to be told. So she kept her camera ready, not knowing she was about to document a moment that would restore her faith in humanity and remind an entire restaurant full of people what it truly means to have dignity in the face of cruelty. The stage was set for an encounter that would change everyone involved, starting with one simple, devastating question that would echo through the restaurant in just a few short minutes. Darla pushed through the heavy glass doors of the Garden Terrace, her heart hammering against her ribs. The restaurant's interior took her breath away, soaring ceilings with exposed brick, Edison bulb chandeliers casting warm amber light across, polished marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light. This wasn't just lunch. This was her shot at the big leagues. She'd spent her last $200 on the navy blazer she was wearing, paired with her only good pair of heels that she'd borrowed from me 6 months ago and never returned. Her portfolio bag felt heavier than usual, weighted down with 3 years of work, late nights, and dreams of proving everyone wrong who said social media marketing was just a phase. The hostess, a perfectly polished woman named Bethany, led Darla to a prime table near the windows. "Your guests called to say they're running 15 minutes behind," she said with a practiced smile. "Can I start you with something to drink?" Darla ordered water, not wanting to risk spilling anything on her presentation materials, and settled into her chair. That's when she noticed Wesley again through the window. He was closer now, maybe 20 feet from where she sat, positioned right next to the outdoor patio where that magnificent piano waited under a cream-colored umbrella. From this angle, she could see him more clearly. His clothes were clean but worn thin, like he took care of what little he had. His beard was gray and untrimmed, but his eyes were sharp and alert. He wasn't asking for money aggressively like some panhandlers she'd encountered. Instead, he sat quietly, occasionally nodding politely when people walked past, sometimes offering a gentle "God bless" whether they gave him anything or not. What struck Darla most was his posture. Despite everything he'd clearly been through, Wesley sat straight-backed with his shoulders squared. When a young mother with 2 children approached the restaurant entrance, he actually stood up and held the door for them, tipping an invisible hat with old-fashioned courtesy. "Thank you, sir," the woman said, surprised but grateful. "My pleasure, ma'am," Wesley replied, his voice carrying a slight southern drawl that spoke of better times. But it was what happened next that made Darla pull out her phone to start recording. After the family disappeared inside, Wesley turned toward that piano like a moth drawn to flame. He took 3 steps closer, close enough to touch the polished black surface, and his entire demeanor changed. His weathered hands rose slightly, fingers curved as if they were already touching keys. Darla watched, mesmerized, as those fingers began moving in complex patterns against the air. His eyes closed, and for just a moment, his face transformed. The lines of worry and exhaustion smoothed away, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. She'd seen that expression before, in her college music classes. It was the look of someone hearing a symphony in their head, someone who understood music in ways most people never would. Her finger hovered over the record button, but something held her back. This felt too private, too sacred to capture without permission. Wesley's moment of reverie was broken by a sharp voice from inside the restaurant. "Excuse me, but is that vagrant bothering customers?" A man in an expensive suit was gesturing toward Wesley while speaking to the manager. "This is supposed to be an upscale establishment. Some of us are trying to conduct business here." The manager, a thin man named Robert who looked perpetually stressed, glanced nervously toward the windows. "I'll handle it, Mr. Richardson. We can't have him disrupting the dining experience." But before Robert could move, another voice cut through the restaurant's ambient chatter. "Oh my God, look at this guy." Someone laughed loudly. "Is he pretending to play piano? That's actually hilarious." Darla turned to see a table of 5 young professionals, all designer clothes and overconfident smirks. The one who'd spoken was particularly obnoxious. Perfectly styled hair, expensive watch, and the kind of entitled attitude that came from never facing real adversity. His name tag from some corporate event read, "Chad Morrison, Senior Investment Advisor." "Someone should totally film this," Chad continued, already pulling out his iPhone. "My followers would love this content. Look at him. He actually thinks he's some kind of musician." The group erupted in cruel laughter, and Darla felt her stomach twist. She watched Wesley through the window, saw him step back from the piano, as if he'd been physically pushed. His moment of peace shattered, replaced by the familiar look of someone who'd learned to expect mockery instead of kindness. That's when Wesley's eyes met hers through the glass. For just a second, their gazes locked, and Darla saw something that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. It wasn't shame or anger or even sadness. It was resignation. The look of someone who'd stopped expecting the world to surprise him with anything good. She had no idea that in just a few minutes Wesley would surprise everyone. Chad Morrison wasn't content with just filming from inside. He pushed back his chair with deliberate force, the legs scraping against marble loud enough to draw attention from neighboring tables. His lunch companions, 3 men and 1 woman, all sporting the same predatory smirk, followed his lead like pack animals sensing entertainment. "This is too good to pass up," Chad announced, his voice carrying that particular brand of cruelty that comes from never facing consequences. "My Instagram stories have been boring lately. Time to create some content." Darla watched in horror as the group moved toward the patio doors. She glanced at her watch. Her clients would arrive in 10 minutes, but she couldn't tear herself away from what was unfolding. Every instinct screamed at her to intervene, but her practical side whispered about the career opportunity she couldn't afford to lose. Chad burst through the patio doors like he owned the place, his phone already recording. "Hey there, maestro," he called out in a voice dripping with fake friendliness. "I saw you eyeing that piano. You a musician or something?" Wesley looked up slowly, his weathered face betraying nothing. "I used to play, son. Long time ago. Used to play." Chad turned to his phone camera, addressing his future audience. "Guys, we've got ourselves a former piano player here. What do you say we give him a chance to relive his glory days?" The woman. In Chad's group, a blonde named Tiffany wearing pearls that probably cost more than Darla's rent, giggled behind her manicured hand. "Oh, Chad, you're terrible. But seriously, this could go viral." Other diners had started gathering near the windows now, drawn by the commotion. Darla noticed an elderly couple shaking their heads in disgust, but they made no move to intervene. A businessman at the bar pulled out his own phone, already sensing this might become social media gold. Wesley remained seated on the small concrete ledge he'd claimed as his spot, his cardboard sign resting beside him. "I don't want any trouble," he said quietly. "Just trying to get by." "No trouble at all," Chad insisted, his tone becoming more theatrical by the moment. "See, here's what I'm thinking. You want money, right? And we want entertainment. So let's make a deal." He reached into his wallet and pulled out a crisp $20 bill, waving it like a flag. The gesture was designed to humiliate, to reduce Wesley to a performing animal working for scraps. "You play us a song on that beautiful piano over there, and this 20 is yours. But here's the catch. It has to be good. None of that chopsticks nonsense." Wesley's eyes moved from Chad's face to the money to the piano. Something flickered across his expression, too quick for most people to catch. But Darla saw it. Recognition, longing, and beneath it all, a pain so deep it made her throat tighten. "My hands aren't what they used to be," Wesley said, flexing his fingers slowly. "Haven't played in years." "Excuses already?" Chad's friend Marcus chimed in, a stocky man with a cruel laugh. "Come on, old-timer, $20 for a few minutes of work. That's more than minimum wage. Way more than you're worth," Tiffany added, earning approving nods from the group. The gathering crowd was growing larger now. Some looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but human nature kept them watching. Darla recognized the expression on their faces. The same morbid curiosity that made people slow down at car accidents. Chad wasn't finished. He walked closer to Wesley, close enough that the older man had to look up to meet his eyes. "Tell you what, Grandpa, I'm feeling generous today. Let's make it interesting." He pulled out another 20. $40 if you can play something actually impressive. But if you can't cut it, if you embarrass yourself up there, then you pack up your little sign and move along. This is a respectable establishment." The cruelty in his voice was matched by the approving murmurs from his friends. They were feeding off each other's energy, each comment more vicious than the last. Darla felt sick watching it unfold, but she was frozen between her conscience and her career. Wesley stood up slowly, his joints protesting after hours of sitting on concrete. He was taller than he'd appeared sitting down, maybe 6 feet, with the kind of bearing that suggested he'd once commanded respect. He looked at the $40 in Chad's hand, then at the piano, then at the crowd of faces staring at him with varying degrees of expectation and disdain. "Just one song," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'll need a moment to remember." Chad's grin was victorious and ugly. "Take all the time you need, maestro. We're not going anywhere." The trap was set, the audience assembled, and Wesley Thornton was about to walk into what everyone assumed would be his public humiliation. Wesley walked toward the piano with the careful gait of a man who'd learned to measure each step. The distance couldn't have been more than 15 feet, but it felt like crossing a canyon. Every eye in the restaurant was on him now, faces pressed against windows, phones raised and ready to capture what they expected would be a spectacular failure. Darla watched Chad position himself for the perfect angle, his phone held high to capture both Wesley's face and his hands on the keys. The investment advisor was practically vibrating with anticipation, already composing the caption in his head about teaching homeless people lessons about knowing their place. The piano bench sat empty under the patio umbrella, its black leather, seat worn smooth by countless musicians who'd played here over the years. Wesley approached it like he was greeting an old friend he wasn't sure would remember him. He stood behind the bench for a long moment, his eyes tracing the elegant curves of the instrument. "Any day now, Mozart," Marcus called out, earning another round of laughter from Chad's group. "We don't have all afternoon." Wesley ignored the comment completely. Instead, he did something that surprised everyone watching. He walked around to the front of the piano and placed both hands flat against its polished surface, his palms pressing against the wood like he was taking its pulse. His eyes closed and his lips moved silently, as if he were having a conversation with the instrument itself. "What's he doing?" Tiffany whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is he praying to a piano?" But Darla recognized the gesture. She'd seen it in her college music classes, when her professor would touch his violin before particularly difficult pieces. It was a ritual, a moment of connection between musician and instrument. Wesley wasn't praying. He was remembering. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds, Wesley moved to the bench and sat down. He adjusted his position twice, finding the exact spot where his body felt balanced. Then he did something else that caught Darla's attention. He rolled his shoulders back and straightened his spine, and suddenly his entire presence changed. The homeless man who'd been sitting quietly by the entrance was gone. In his place sat someone who belonged at a piano, someone who understood that an instrument this beautiful demanded respect and proper posture. Wesley placed his hands above the keyboard without touching the keys. His fingers curved naturally, muscle memory from decades past taking over despite the years of absence. He took 3 deep breaths, each one seeming to center him further. "This is taking forever," Chad complained, but his voice carried less confidence than before. Something about Wesley's transformation was unsettling him, though he couldn't put his finger on what. Wesley opened his eyes and looked directly at his tormentors. When he spoke, his voice was steadier than it had been all afternoon. "I want to tell you something about this piano before I play," he said. "It's a 1952 Steinway Baby Grand. See that serial number there? This particular instrument was built in Hamburg, not New York. The touch is lighter, the sustain longer. She's been well maintained." The specificity of his knowledge created an uncomfortable silence. Chad's smirk faltered slightly. Even people who knew nothing about pianos could hear the authority in Wesley's voice. "During the war, I dreamed about pianos like this one," Wesley continued, his weathered hands still hovering above the keys. "When the mortars were falling and we were pinned down in rice paddies, I'd close my eyes and play entire concertos in my head. Rachmaninoff, Chopin, Liszt. The music kept me sane when everything else was falling apart." Darla felt goosebumps rise on her arms. This wasn't the rambling of a broken-down vagrant. This was testimony from someone who'd lived through hell and found salvation in music. Wesley's fingers finally made contact with the keys, but he didn't press them yet. Just the lightest touch, like a greeting between old lovers. "I haven't played in public for 15 years, he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Not since the nightmares got so bad I couldn't handle crowds. But today feels different." He looked up at Chad one more time, and Darla saw something in Wesley's eyes that made her start recording despite her earlier hesitation. It wasn't anger or defiance. It was something far more powerful. It was a man who'd found his courage again, who'd decided that some moments were worth the risk. "This song is for my brothers who didn't make it home," Wesley said simply. "And for everyone who's forgotten what it means to have dignity." His hands settled into position, and the restaurant held its breath. The first note hung in the air like a prayer. Wesley's right hand touched middle C with the gentleness of someone greeting a beloved friend, and the sound that emerged from the Steinway was pure and crystalline. But it was just the beginning. What started as a simple, haunting melody quickly blossomed into something extraordinary. Wesley's left hand joined in, laying down a foundation of bass notes that seemed to resonate not just through the piano, but through the very bones of everyone listening. He was playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, but this wasn't just a performance. This was poetry written in sound. Chad's phone trembled in his hands as he watched Wesley's fingers dance across the keys with impossible precision. The cruel smirk had vanished from his face, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. This wasn't supposed to happen. The homeless man was supposed to fumble through "Mary Had a Little Lamb" and then slink away in embarrassment. Instead, Wesley commanded the piano like he'd been born to it. His weathered hands moved with fluid grace, each finger finding its mark with the kind of muscle memory that comes from decades of dedicated practice. The years melted away as he played, and the broken man who'd been sitting by the restaurant entrance disappeared completely. The restaurant fell into absolute silence except for the music. Conversations died mid-sentence. Silverware stopped clinking against plates. Even the kitchen staff had emerged from the back, drawn by sounds they'd never expected to hear from their patio piano. Wesley transitioned seamlessly from Chopin into Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2, his fingers finding the complex passages with startling ease. The music swelled and soared, filling the space with emotions that had no names. Joy and sorrow intertwined. Hope and heartbreak danced together in perfect harmony. Darla's hands shook as she held her phone, tears streaming down her face without her even realizing it. She'd filmed hundreds of videos, but nothing had ever felt this important. Through her lens, she watched Wesley's face transform completely. The lines of worry and exhaustion were still there, but they were overshadowed by something beautiful, pure joy. This was a man doing exactly what he was born to do. An elderly woman at a corner table gasped audibly and rose from her seat. Her name was Eleanor Hastings, though nobody knew that yet. She was 83 years old, had taught music at Portland State University for 40 years, and she was staring at Wesley like she'd seen a ghost. "It can't be," she whispered, but her voice carried in the hushed restaurant. "Wesley? Wesley Thornton?" Wesley heard his name but didn't stop playing. His eyes found Eleanor's face, and recognition flickered across his features. A smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from him all day. "My God," Eleanor continued, her voice growing stronger as she moved closer to the piano. "Ladies and gentlemen, do you have any idea who this man is?" The crowd turned toward her, confused but captivated. Chad lowered his phone completely, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. Eleanor's voice rang out clear and strong. "This is Wesley Thornton. He performed with the Portland Symphony Orchestra for 8 years. He played Carnegie Hall 3 times before he was 30. He was considered one of the most promising classical pianists on the West Coast before he was drafted to Vietnam in 1969. The revelation hit the crowd like a physical force. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the restaurant as people processed what they were hearing. The homeless veteran they'd been ready to mock and dismiss was actually a musical legend who'd sacrificed his career to serve his country. Wesley's playing grew more intense, as if Eleanor's words had unleashed something he'd kept locked away for decades. His fingers flew across the keys and passages that seemed impossible for human hands to execute. The music built to a crescendo that made the wine glasses on nearby tables vibrate in sympathy. Chad stood frozen, his face pale and his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The $40 he'd offered as payment suddenly seemed obscene. Around him, his friends looked equally stunned, their earlier laughter replaced by uncomfortable silence. But Wesley wasn't finished. As the Rachmaninoff reached its thunderous conclusion, he transitioned into something even more personal, a piece he'd composed himself during the darkest days of the war. a melody that captured both the horror of combat and the fierce love he felt for the brothers fighting beside him. The final notes faded slowly, leaving the restaurant in profound silence. Wesley's hands remained on the keys for a moment longer, as if he couldn't bear to break the connection. When he finally lifted them, the spell was broken, and the crowd erupted into applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. Wesley. Thornton had just reminded everyone what it meant to witness true greatness. The applause seemed to go on forever, but it was the silence that followed that truly mattered. In that hushed moment, Chad Morrison stood completely still, his face drained of color, staring at Wesley like he was seeing him for the first time. The $40 in his hand suddenly felt like an insult so profound he couldn't bring himself to offer it. Instead, Chad walked slowly to the piano where Wesley still sat, his weathered hands resting quietly on the keys. Without a word, Chad pulled out his entire wallet and placed it on top of the piano. His voice, when it finally came, was barely a whisper. "I'm sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." Wesley looked up at him with eyes that held no anger, only a quiet dignity that made Chad's shame burn even deeper. "We all make mistakes, son. The question is what we do after we make them." The restaurant manager, Robert, appeared at Wesley's side with tears in his eyes. "Sir, I don't know what to say. I was about to ask you to leave, and instead you've given us the most beautiful performance this restaurant has ever seen." He paused, gathering courage. "Would you consider playing here regularly? Our dinner guests would be honored to hear you perform." Before Wesley could answer, Eleanor Hastings reached the piano. She was crying openly now, her hands shaking as she touched Wesley's shoulder. "Wesley, my dear boy, where have you been? The music world mourned you when you disappeared after the war." Wesley's composure finally cracked. 40 years of carrying shame and trauma alone seemed to pour out of him in that moment. "The nightmares, Eleanor. I couldn't handle crowds anymore. Every time I sat at a piano in public, I'd see the faces of the boys who didn't come home. I'd hear the mortars falling. The music would turn into screaming." Eleanor knelt beside the piano bench, her voice gentle but firm. "And yet you played today. What changed?" Wesley glanced toward Chad, then at the crowd of faces surrounding him. "Sometimes you realize that staying silent dishonors the very people you're trying to honor. My brothers didn't die, so their memory could be buried with my fear." Darla had been recording everything, but now she lowered her phone and approached the piano. Her business meeting was completely forgotten, replaced by something far more important. "Mr. Thornton, if you're comfortable with it, I'd like to share your story. Not to exploit you, but to honor you. To show people that we never know who we're looking at when we pass judgment." Wesley studied her face carefully, seeing something genuine that had been missing from most interactions he'd had in recent years. "What would you want to say?" "That dignity isn't something you lose when you lose everything else. That service to our country deserves respect, not ridicule. That talent and worth exist in places we'd never think to look." Darla's voice grew stronger with each word. "And that sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone to see them as human beings instead of problems to be solved or entertainment to be consumed." The crowd around the piano had grown to include virtually everyone in the restaurant. Phones were recording now, but the energy was completely different from Chad's earlier cruelty. These were people documenting something sacred, something they knew they'd want to remember forever. An older businessman stepped forward and placed a $100 bill on the piano. "Thank you for your service, sir, both to our country and to music." Others followed suit, not with the condescending charity Chad had originally offered, but with the respect due to an artist who had just shared his soul with strangers. 3 months later, Darla's video had been viewed over 20 million times. But more importantly, it had sparked a national conversation about how society treats veterans and homeless individuals. Wesley was living in a small apartment downtown, teaching piano to underprivileged children and performing twice a week at the Garden Terrace to sold-out crowds. Chad had quit his job at the investment firm and was now working full-time for a nonprofit organization that provided housing and mental health services to homeless veterans. His first client had been Wesley himself, helping him navigate the VA system to get the PTSD treatment he'd needed for decades. The $40 Chad had originally offered still sat on Wesley's piano at home, never spent. Not as a reminder of cruelty, but as evidence that people could change when confronted with their own capacity for both harm and healing. Darla never made it to that business meeting, but she didn't need to. Her video had launched a career focused on telling stories that mattered, showing the world that extraordinary moments happen when we choose to see people as they truly are, rather than as we assume them to be. Sometimes it takes a single song to change everything,